Well, good evening, Minister, distinguished guests, and first of all, I would like to thank Joe for inviting me to speak here tonight on such a subject. I think that education is the future, not just for the next 5 years, but indeed for many years to come, and the students whom we are educating today are going to be the citizens of tomorrow and carrying so much of the burdens that we are all worrying about at the moment. So getting the education system right is obviously a very important thing. Before I start, I'm going to sound very utilitarian and perhaps could be thought of as ignoring the social and individual richness that an education can bring to an individual. So I just want to say, Joe, that my PhD was on Peadar O'Donnell, and it is wonderful to be back in Donegal. Listening to the news this morning, I was also struck that 75% of the exports from Ireland go to multinationals, and the multinationals are investing in this country because of the human capital that we have. And I think we are all very well aware of this. Don has already mentioned the role of education in contributing to economic growth, and that is well recognised internationally. And continuing to build on the educational strengths and outcomes achieved to date in Ireland, and I'm going to talk about some of the strengths very briefly, is part of the government's strategy. And so tonight the theme that we have is how can Ireland's tertiary education system continue to provide students with appropriate learning, to upgrade the stock of skills of the existing labour force, and to improve the innovative capacity of our institutions at a time of diminishing budgetary resources. And I shall argue that we must reorient the provision of education and training to meet the social and economic challenge. I do have a paper available, and anybody who wants it can have it afterwards. And I have one more disclaimer. I'm speaking in a personal capacity, not as anything to do with the HEA. All the mistakes that I make are mine, and in putting on my glasses tonight, I am looking at the Irish tertiary education system as I would have done had I been in the World Bank still, because I think trying to look at it objectively is also perhaps what is useful. I'm going to quickly go through the strengths of the system, and I think that we all agree that it's quite remarkable that in spite of the declining budgets, and they have been declining, that the universities and the institutes of technology have shown tremendous responsiveness. I mean, the HEA estimates that between 2004 and 2009, full-time student numbers have increased by 20%, and public funding for full-time students has fallen by 16%. Yet, we must be proud of the fact that all our institutions, all the universities and the DIT rank in the top 500 in world rankings, and indeed 2 of them rank in the top 100. And this is something we mustn't forget. We're going to talk about issues in a minute, but it's important to say what are our strengths. The National Qualifications Framework gives the access, transfer, progression and quality assurance right across the tertiary education system, and indeed from secondary education. And the new Qualifications and Quality Assurance Ireland, which I understand has just gone into the Dáil for, you've just launched it yesterday, as it? Yes, being published yesterday. And that is another great reassurance for the system, because it's combining higher and further education and training. And this, again, will lead me, before I go on, to mention the other initiative today, which is, of course, the launch of SOLACE, which is the Training and Further Education Authority, which will parallel the HEA, and again, I think will fit in very well with the vision that I would like to outline tonight. However, we do have some issues. I'm going to go through them pretty quickly, but if you see where Ireland stands, the percentage of adults aged 25 to 64 participating in education and training is very low by international standards. And you can see there we rank 7 And if you look at the countries whom we would like to be competing with, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, they have a much larger percentage of their adult population in some form of education or training. We do have serious skills shortages. The National Skills Bulletin of July 2010 identifies these areas in ICT, engineering, science, and we've been reading this in the papers. There are jobs available, and yet somehow we don't seem to have the graduates available to fill those jobs. So there are some mismatches there. Skills training, well, already the Minister is ahead of me on that one by announcing Solace today, because indeed there is a great worry about the costly excess capacity in training, both within FOSS and in the Institutes of Technology. And of course the worry there also is that demand for apprentice training is about 15% of its 2007 peak. This is not anyone's fault. It's again the fall-off of demand from employers. There are inefficiencies in the system, including inflexible work practices, and I'm not going to go into this at this point because some of these issues do come up again, and some of them, we hope, will work through the system and particularly could be addressed through the Croke-Park Agreement. And finally, declining resources, which is going to be one of the themes, of course, tonight, do threaten the quality of provision at all levels, and this is at the moment when we really need to maintain the quality of provision in order to improve our competitiveness. Now, what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at a projection of demand that is truly astonishing. I'm using the figures given to me by the Department of Education and Skills to the year 2030, and if you look at that chart, you see a steadily increasing demand for tertiary education that if it was based on the present numbers that we have, would actually show an increase of 85% over our present numbers. Now, it is true to say that this is a demographic projection and that it is based on the stated government enrolment numbers and objectives. It does not reflect possible changes in the labour market, and it does not reflect the international situation or patterns of migration. Nonetheless, we do know that future demand is going to be enormous and that it's going to look for more first-time learners coming into the system, more adults returning to full or part-time work, full or part-time education, and more students accessing the system in less traditional ways. And that is including the fabulous possibilities of using new technology for learning. And to these groups, not just these people, but to these groups may be added a possible future demand from 2012 onwards of students from the UK who wish to come to Ireland because of the very high fees, now £9,000 in many cases, that will be charged from this autumn for universities in the United Kingdom. I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is my vision for tertiary education, and with the creation of Solace today, in fact, I think it comes together because the system should encompass higher and further education and the non-formal training system. And I wrote this paper and these slides before the announcement of Solace. It should build on the national qualifications framework to provide pathways and mobilities for those individuals who enter education in less traditional ways. It should increase the attractiveness and prestige of technical education and training. And it should be able to assure students that they can achieve progression through the system and are not stuck in dead-end courses where they cannot actually climb up. And in thinking about this, I was thinking about systems like Florida State system in the United States, where community colleges and then universities all are linked together, and somebody can work their way through. An academically able student, in fact, is never then denied access. So it's on this basis that I would hope that the system can develop here. However, financing. Already we see really very serious shortfalls. Preliminary data that the HEA is developing at this moment shows a decrease of 17.4% in the state grant funding for universities over the last 3 years, and a 10% increase in full and part-time university student numbers. So what really has been happening is that the universities, and we don't have figures yet for the institutes of technology, but the universities have been doing a fabulous job, but with for more people, but increasingly less resources. Meanwhile, at the same time, training is incredibly expensive. And you look at these figures and you will wince, because community training centres, a completion cost for one trainee is €53,271, which is an incredible amount of money. And that does not guarantee really a labour market outcome. It does not guarantee a job at the end of it. Now, I have to note that, of course, those costs do include the payment of allowances to trainees. Meanwhile, the Irish taxpayer is, in fact, and these are OECD figures, is paying 85% of the cost of Irish higher education. Now, this was rather higher than the 79% EU average, and it is well above the 69% figure for OECD countries. And if you look at the right-hand side, the OECD average, the blue is 2000, the reddish is 2007. But what is really striking is this represents a reversal of the 2000 figure, when the Irish figure was 79% and significantly below the 86% EU average. So in summary, based on the demographic data, on the expected labour market demands, greatly increased levels of funding will be needed just to sustain the system, and the taxpayer is paying increasingly more. We do know, and we've been told it many times, but I'll say it again, that it's highly unlikely that the system can really expect to attract more funding from the state, given that the coffers are empty. Now, there is supposed to be another slide in here, which my fellow presenter, Brian, gave to me last night at 11 o'clock, and because of my messing with the technology, it's not in there. So I just have to say that the annual expenditure per student has been steadily decreasing against the OECD average, and Brian can show you the graph if you really would love to see it later on. So where can the money come from? Well, philanthropy is one. Philanthropy and contributions from alumni. And this, of course, is something that has really stood Irish higher education in great stead over the years. However, given the current economic situation, it is unlikely to really give much more. And even if institutions can target their alumni, giving is normally aimed at a particular item of university expenditure rather than the growth in general funding requirements. Grants. Well, grants are growing. About 46% of full-time students in 2010 do get means-tested grants. I would argue that means testing of grants should perhaps be done in a different way, so that assets could be taken into consideration, and the reform of the current model could then greatly assist the redistribution of state funding to the benefit of those most in need, but could not be expected to increase the total amount of funding available for tertiary education. And that is, I know, a very controversial subject, but remember, I'm looking at this from the outside, and at the moment, the amount of grants are rising, and in some cases, those who perhaps could benefit more from them are not the ones actually in receipt of them. The next area of possible resource attraction is international students. Now, those of you who've heard me speak about this before will be bored to hear me say it again, but I have done a lot of work internationally, and it is true that international students, there is a huge move for internationalization in higher education, and students are moving more and more around the world, and it's terrific, but we need to be aware that there are some problems with internationalization. One is it will be very important not to pack too many places with foreign students, because the latter do not like coming to study with their fellow nationals, not too many of them. And this is a lesson that Australia learned to its horror, because it did it rather badly, and it's suffering from it now. And unless the quality of the higher education system is maintained, that actually could damage Ireland's currently very good international reputation. And in practice, the majority of international students come to Ireland to study medicine and business. Now, again, that's fine. There are, of course, a lot particular niche areas such as Joyce and Yeats studies and so on. But if we are serious about attracting students to medicine and business, we also need to realize that there are limited places available, particularly in clinical practice in medicine. Economies within the system. I've slightly touched on that. I don't want to spend too much longer on this because I'm worried that the chair is going to start barking, but I would like to say the following. There is a tremendous possibility for economies within the system from the new solace which has been announced today, and that is with the move to the Department of Skills of responsibility for the force training budget. This will definitely allow the department to review the whole of post-secondary education in a coherent way and to reallocate the funds to meet changing priorities. Now, coming to the point. More equitable contributions and student support. From the autumn this year, undergraduate students are going to pay an annual contribution of €2,000 for the first full-time student, and then there will be a reduction for subsequent siblings. And then other students pay fees, variable fees depending. And it's a very good thing that the Minister announced in his speech on higher education to the Royal Irish Academy in May that, in fact, he was going to support the recommendation of the National Strategy by affirming that there will be parity of funding with full-time students for part-time and mature students in accredited courses. So he's going to level the playing field, which is terrific, because why should adult students pay differently to first-time students? However, there are also the costs of living expenses, and the Union of Students in Ireland have given me these fees, and they're pretty colossal. So if you add on the €2,000 and the 7,691 for a student living away from home, you are effectively talking about a cost of €10,000 a year to study. This is, it's not small. The cost to the Irish Exchequer is much different to that. Arts and humanities graduates cost between 21,000 and 28,000. You can read the figures. Science graduates 48,000, and a medical graduate a whopping 180,000, and that is without clinical costs borne by the hospitals. The benefits to students, however, are also significant, reflected in lifetime earnings, quality of life, job satisfaction. And in this context, I ask you to consider the potential lifetime earning of an average physician compared with those of the average taxpayer who has financed her education. It is inequitable that individuals who have the resources, whatever their age and whatever mode of learning they choose, are not required to contribute more to the education which will bring them considerable future benefits. And let us not forget, ladies and gentlemen, that many richer families pay considerable amounts for second-level schools and for special coaching schools for preparation for the Leaving Certificate. Once at university, their tuition is largely met by taxing lower-income earners whose children have not had that advantage. And if I put it to you rather crudely, it would mean that the student in Foxrock is being subsidised by the student in Finglas. And I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, but that sometimes focuses the mind. So, I am suggesting fees. I think that the people who can pay should pay. And I was interested in the presentation this afternoon where we saw that, in fact, in the Citizens' Parliament, that once they actually began to consider what these issues are, that actually the people who began to see the case for paying fees, that number rose. Any new fees policy must ensure that all academically prepared individuals will be able to gain entry to the third level education or training course of their choice, regardless of their ability to pay. And part of those tuition revenues could be used to fund means-tested grants and loans, and we can talk about loans separately because that's a much more long-term thing, but means-tested grants which could enhance accessibility by the more disadvantaged groups. And in making the case for increased contributions from students, I am mindful that this is a very difficult issue, and I'm mindful that it is difficult politically. In advocating a return to student fees in Ireland, it is also very important to avoid what is happening in the UK, where the government has miscalculated by allowing institutions to set fees up to a cap of 9,000. That is not what a policy should do. Fees should be set by the government, in my view, and should vary by institution and by specialisation, and should reflect, at least in part, their relative costs. And we've seen what those costs are. And ideally, Ireland should move to means testing students to determine eligibility for fees exemption. Otherwise, a realistic level of tuition fees will not be able to be set for that segment of the population that can afford to pay. And I've referred to that already earlier. Now, student lending. Student loans, it's a very technical subject, and I don't think we're going to have time. But very briefly, it's my last point. Student loans can improve the accessibility of tertiary education. A loan scheme, not the one in the United States, which is a mortgage scheme, but a loan scheme for both living costs and tuition fees that allows education to be free at the time of education and for repayment out of the future of education, future income, is what I think we should realistically move to. Now, this cannot be done quickly, but it's something which students are already finding problems paying that 10,000 a year. And in Ireland, in order to do that, the cooperation of these departments would have to be sought. Students can make their own calculations. They know if they buy a car, they know they have to pay for it. But this way, they would only pay back if they get a job up to a certain level over a certain lifetime of their income earning. There is international experience of loans. There is a highly respected model of income contingent lending, although by no means the only one, and that is the Australian model. And there is also in the Student Loan Company in Glasgow an excellent working model of how to administer such a thing. My thinking is that to ask international experts at least to consider this as soon as possible and to begin to put it in place. It's not something that's going to get us out of our current situation, because I'm afraid the current situation can't wait. But it's something that there should be in place so that as we recover and as students continue to bear the inevitably rising costs of their education, that it will in fact be in place to help them. And I believe it will be almost impossible to achieve a further increase in private contributions unless such a facility for our students to borrow at attractive rates is created. And I know the banks are broken, but nonetheless, I put it to you for consideration. And finally, above all else, and this is my last slide and my last point, and thank you for your patience, the danger is we would reach a tipping point. The danger is that without fees, and in the absence of adequate public funding for all third-level institutions, either they will have to cap enrolments, because we've seen what those numbers are looking like going up. So in order to maintain the quality of what we have, they cannot just continue to take in students. Or the opposite. And I quote a very well-known Australian writer on this subject here. Bruce Johnston, who says, permit such levels of overcrowding and shabbiness such that all students may be denied a decent higher education. And I know that none of us wants that. Thank you very much.